It was the summer of 2016 in Springfield, Illinois, one of those small towns where everyone knows each other, and the silence of the streets is almost a character. The days were warm, the air carried the scent of trees and freshly cut lawns, and the routine was predictable, almost boring. It was the kind of place where nothing really happened until the day Melissa Turner disappeared. At first, it seemed like just an ordinary delay, something simple, something anyone could explain with a phone call or a text message. But night fell. The phone remained silent and her car was found a few blocks from home, locked inside, with the keys still in the ignition. A small but disturbing detail that would make the entire town question what had really happened that afternoon. Melissa was a quiet woman, known by everyone in the neighborhood. She worked at the local hospital, cared for her elderly mother, and was seen almost every day taking her son, Evan, to school. She had no enemies, didn't get into trouble, and there was nothing about her that suggested danger, and perhaps that's why her disappearance caused so much distress, because if something like this could happen to someone like Melissa, it could happen to anyone. The police even considered it a voluntary escape, something related to personal problems. It was the kind of quick explanation that serves to silence the curious, but fails to convince those who truly knew the victim. As the hours passed, Springfield became increasingly uneasy. People began to remember small details. A white van no one knew who owned it. A metallic sound coming from a vacant lot. A man who always watched the streets in the late afternoon. None of this made sense in isolation, but it formed a strange chain of coincidences. It was as if the entire town had stored fragments of a story that was only now beginning to piece together. And the most frightening thing was realizing that Melissa hadn't disappeared in a remote location, nor on a deserted road. She had vanished in broad daylight in a safe neighborhood, surrounded by watchful neighbors. As the days turned into weeks, her name began to be repeated in hushed tones in cafes, in supermarket lines, in quick conversations between neighbors who suddenly started locking their doors early. And behind every suspicious glance grew a question no one dared ask aloud. How could a woman disappear like that, without anyone seeing anything? Anyone who gets chills listening to stories like this, who imagines every detail and tries to understand where it all began to go wrong, knows that the mystery doesn't end when the lights go out. Every disappearance like Melissa's carries pain, secrets, and truths that many people never had the courage to share. But here we do. Here those who listen aren't spectators. They're part of a community that feels, that investigates, that relives together every step of these stories, full of twists and turns and chilling discoveries. This is the place for those who believe that every disappearance has a hidden truth waiting to be revealed. So come be a part of it, like to strengthen this journey, and subscribe to the channel now, because the next stories will take your breath away. Melissa Turner has always been the kind of person who seemed to carry the world on her shoulders and still find room for a smile. Born and raised in Springfield, she knew every corner of that town as if it were an extension of her own home. From a young age, she learned that life was rarely kind, but that it was still worth living with dignity. Working as a nurse, Melissa became known for her patience, her calm way of speaking, and her never-ending effort when someone needed her. She was the kind of woman who seemed invisible to the world, but irreplaceable to those who truly knew her. After the divorce, her life seemed like a long series of poorly stitched-together restarts. Her husband, an auto parts salesman named Richard, had left under the pretext of needing space, but everyone knew he'd found comfort in the arms of another woman. Melissa, however, never allowed herself to sink. She raised little Evan alone, worked night shifts, and in her few hours of rest, cared for her mother, who was already facing the onset of a silent and cruel Alzheimer's. It was an exhausting routine, the kind that breaks anyone's core, but she kept going, always saying she couldn't stop, that people depended on her. The neighbors saw her as a role model, that woman with the tired eyes and sweet smile, who dropped her son off at school every day and headed straight to the hospital with a coffee in hand. But behind her apparent strength, there was something no one noticed. Melissa was exhausted, emotionally drained, juggling too many responsibilities and getting almost nothing in return. Sometimes at night, after Evan fell asleep, she would stand on the porch staring into space, as if waiting for the wind to bring answers. There was a loneliness. There, the kind that isn't cured by company, only by peace. And peace was something she hadn't known in a long time. In the months before her disappearance, Melissa began to change small habits. She avoided leaving the house after work, locked her doors more carefully, and was startled by noises she'd previously ignored. She told a co-worker that she'd been feeling something strange, as if she were being watched. They laughed at her, saying it was just fatigue, that maybe stress was playing tricks. But there was something different in her eyes when she said it, a mix of fear and intuition. It was as if she knew something bad was about to happen. She just didn't know when. The curious thing is that Springfield wasn't the kind of place that inspired fear. People left bicycles outside their houses, neighbors waved, and children played in the streets until dark. Nothing there seemed threatening, and perhaps that was precisely why no one believed her. To many, Melissa was simply an overwhelmed woman struggling with the weight of a difficult life. But to those who paid attention, there were subtle signs that something deeper was going on. She began leaving objects in strange places, a key inside the microwave, her cell phone inside the refrigerator. Once she found the front door unlocked when she returned from work, swearing she had locked it before leaving. The next-door neighbor, a lady named Martha, even mentioned seeing a car parked in front of Melissa's house at different times. Always the same old light-colored model. She said that once, upon closer inspection, she saw a man in the driver's seat, just watching. She thought it was paranoia, and never mentioned it to the police. After all, who would believe her? All of this was forgotten, swallowed up by routine until August 14th arrived. That morning, Melissa seemed normal. She woke up early, made her son's breakfast, left the boy with his grandmother, and left, saying she needed to stop by the grocery store before her shift. She carried a simple list: bread, milk, cereal, and some fruit. The last person to see her was the cashier, who remembered her hurried look, as if she wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. At noon, she didn't show up for work. At 4, the hospital called home, and the confused mother replied that Melissa hadn't returned yet. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, the family knew something was wrong. Police were called around 7 p.m. Melissa's car was found just 3 blocks from home, perfectly parked, with the keys still in the ignition and her purse on the passenger seat. Nothing was disturbed. There were no signs of a struggle, no trace of a break-in. It seemed she had simply vanished into thin air. And it was this strangeness that left everyone baffled. It made no sense. No woman with Melissa's profile would abandon her son and mother so suddenly. Still, the initial report listed the case as a possible voluntary flight. As officers concluded their search that first day, something broke within the family. Evan asked when his mother would return, and his grandmother repeated that she had only gone away for a while, but uncertainty already gripped the house. In the neighborhood, whispers began. Theories were circulating. Comparisons were made with other disappearances that no one had ever connected. Some said she had run away for love, others that she had gone mad. And among so many versions, a single truth lingered. Melissa had vanished without a trace, and no one knew why. But what few remember is that days earlier, Melissa had told her co-worker that she felt she was being followed. She said she saw the same man in a dark cap near the hospital parking lot, always at the same time. No one took it seriously. It was another one of those stories that end up getting lost in everyday life. Only now, after everything, that detail would take on new weight, a completely different meaning. Hours turned into days, and days into weeks. Hope began to fade like an old photograph forgotten in the sun. The searches ceased, the posters began to tear in the rain, and little by little, the town learned to live with the silence that remained. But for those who knew Melissa, the story didn't make sense. Something inside those closest to her told her this wasn't the end. And amidst the despair and disbelief, only one question remained, echoing through the alleys and locked houses of Springfield: what really happened after? Melissa got into that car, grocery list in hand, and a look no one could decipher. At first, no one noticed. It seemed like just another ordinary day in Springfield, where time passes slowly and any unusual noise blends into the sound of cars and birds. But that afternoon, something small, almost insignificant, began to bother everyone who knew Melissa. It was her brother, Tom Turner, the first to sense something was wrong. He tried calling a few times with no answer. He found the silence. Strange, because Melissa was always attentive and responded immediately, especially when her son was with his grandmother. That night, he decided to go to her house. Everything was exactly as usual. The kitchen light was on, the kettle still warm, the cell phone plugged into the charger next to the bed. What caught his attention was the fact that the door was unlocked, something Melissa would never do. Tom paced the rooms, calling his sister's name, trying to convince himself she would return at any moment. But time passed, and the emptiness of the house seemed to scream. He noticed the car wasn't in the garage and imagined she might have left quickly, perhaps even forgotten her cell phone. Still, there was a strange feeling in the air, a kind of unease he couldn't explain. That's when he called the local market and discovered she had indeed been there hours earlier, and that she had left alone, carrying only 2 small bags. The clerk remembered her face, her hurried look, the way she checked her watch before leaving. It was as if she were trying to escape something, but no one could say what. The next day, when Melissa's car was found parked a few blocks from home, her discomfort turned to despair. The keys were still in the ignition, the driver's seat was too far back for her, and in the back seat one of the grocery bags was torn, with an apple rolled across the floorboard. The police arrived quickly, but their tone was cold and bureaucratic. They asked shallow questions, jotted down details, and finally blurted out the same comment so many would make later: maybe she just left. Tom tried to explain that it didn't make sense, that Melissa would never abandon her son, that she was a predictable, methodical woman stuck in a routine, but it seemed no one wanted to listen. Over the next few days, the small details began to pile up like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. Neighbor Martha said she saw a white van driving slowly down the street shortly, before Melissa disappeared. Another resident reported hearing a metallic noise like a door slamming shut. A hospital employee commented that Melissa had mentioned being followed the night before, but even with all this, the police insisted on treating the case as a self-absconding. The truth is, no one wanted to believe something terrible could happen so close to home. It was easier to imagine she had simply given up on her life than to accept that real danger was circling among them. As the hours dragged on, word spread throughout the city. In cafes, lines, and neighborhood groups, Melissa's name began to surface in whispered conversations. Everyone had a theory, everyone had a hunch, but no one had proof. And as time passed, the feeling of helplessness grew. Springfield was beginning to change. People who once left their doors open now locked them. Children stopped playing alone in the street. The city, once calm and predictable, became a suspicious place, riddled with fear. Tom, however, couldn't rest. He returned every night to the spot where the car had been found, as if waiting for some detail to jump out at him. And it was there, on the 3rd night, that he noticed something no one had seen before. Tire tracks on the side of the road, different from those on his sister's car. They continued for a few meters and disappeared around a bend where vegetation began to cover the ground. It wasn't much, but it was enough to spark a doubt that would keep him awake. By then, Melissa's case was beginning to fade in the official records. The police were already talking about calling off the search, and the local newspapers, which had initially covered every detail, now barely mentioned her name. But for the family, especially Tom, nothing made sense. He knew something was wrong. This was no ordinary disappearance. It was as if someone had planned the whole thing, erasing every trace before anyone even realized what was happening. And perhaps what tormented him most was the memory of their last conversation. Days before she disappeared, Melissa called him late one night. She said she was tired, that she felt like something was watching her, but then laughed, saying it must be all in her head. He tried to reassure her, and she promised to visit him this weekend. Now that phone call echoed like an omen, a cry for help he couldn't hear. The morning after discovering the tire tracks, Tom decided to return to that road alone. The sun hadn't even risen yet when he knelt on the ground, examining every detail, trying to understand what the tracks might reveal. It was there in that silence, punctuated only by the distant sound of crickets, that something made him stop. A piece of fabric stuck to a branch, torn, covered in dust. It was small, but it had a floral pattern he would recognize anywhere. It was part of the dress Melissa was wearing the day she disappeared. And in that instant, even before he understood its meaning, he knew this story was far from over. And as he held the piece of cloth in his trembling hands, a feeling came over him, that someone somewhere was still watching. The days passed, and Melissa's case seemed about to be forgotten. The police had already closed the report. The neighbors returned to their routines, and people began to avoid talking about the matter. But there was one person who couldn't let the case go. The detective, Dana Collins. She was known within the department for her stubbornness and her habit of revisiting old files, especially those that had never been finalized, and it was during one of these long nights, surrounded by piles of forgotten folders and cold coffee, that she came across Melissa Turner's name. At first, it seemed like just another unsolved disappearance, but as Dana read the details, something caught her eye. The dates, the times, the places. There was a pattern. 3 women had disappeared under similar circumstances, all within a 3-mile radius, always on weekends. None of them had any prior records. All were last seen in public places, and in each case the car had been found intact, as if the person had simply vanished. For most investigators, it was just a coincidence. For Dana, too many coincidences often hide something. She began comparing testimonies, reviewing old security camera footage, and mapping the locations where each woman had disappeared. When she put it all together on a makeshift dashboard on her office wall, what she saw chilled her insides. All the dots connected around a single area, a seemingly quiet neighborhood with narrow streets and few residents. It was the same neighborhood where Melissa lived, and most disturbingly, the last sign of her life, captured by a traffic camera, showed a white van slowly driving down one of the streets leading to the city center. The same van had appeared in another disappearance 3 months earlier. Dana knew she was on to something big, but she also knew no one would easily believe it. The department had already moved on, classifying the cases as voluntary escapes or isolated events, but she saw a pattern: ordinary women disappearing in the same way, within the same region, for no apparent reason. This wasn't coincidence, it was method. One quiet morning, she decided to comb through old emergency call files, searching for something that might confirm her theory. It was then that she came across a strange report from a resident who claimed to have heard screams coming from a vacant lot on the outskirts of town, days after Melissa's disappearance. At the time, the report was dismissed. Probably teenagers making a mess, they noted, but the location described in the call was just 2 streets away from the victim's home. The detective stood still for a few seconds, trying to process what it meant. A chill ran down her spine. In the following days, she began asking discreet questions. She visited the market where Melissa was last seen, spoke with employees, reviewed old cameras, and realized that time had erased almost everything. Still, there was one detail no one had noticed. In the reflection of the cashier's glass, she could see outside the silhouette of a man standing next to the white van. He was looking directly at Melissa. His face wasn't clearly visible, but his posture was firm, almost motionless, as if waiting for her. Dana paused the video several times, zoomed in, and even without concrete proof, she was certain of one thing: that man wasn't there by chance. With each new discovery, Melissa's case became more personal. Dana felt a mix of fascination and anger, as if each ignored clue were an open wound. She began to realize how much the system failed to protect women like Melissa, ordinary, hard-working, powerless women, whose pain was ultimately swallowed up by bureaucracy. And perhaps that's why she became more involved than she should have. She began visiting the neighborhood in her spare time, observing streets, noting routines, studying faces. She knew that somewhere there was someone who held more than met the eye. It was on one of these trips that she first saw the vacant lot mentioned in the old report. The tall grass hid a metal container partially covered with tarps and dry branches. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than a rubble dump, but something about the scene bothered her. There were fresh tire tracks on the ground and a reinforced lock on the gate. It was the kind of detail that would go unnoticed by anyone except her. That night, Dana couldn't sleep. She mentally relived every clue, every loose end of the story, trying to piece together the puzzle everyone else had abandoned. And the more she thought, the more she realized the answer was there, hidden just a few feet from where it all began. Only no one wanted to see it. And it was precisely this feeling, that danger could be so close without anyone noticing, that began to take hold of her. Because, as she tried to understand what connected these women, a new clue was about to emerge. And this time it wouldn't come from the archives. It would come from someone who was watching her too. When Detective Dana Collins presented her suspicions to her superiors, she expected at least a look of interest, a spark of concern, any sign that Melissa Turner's case still mattered. But what she received was disbelief. The captain simply leafed through the papers leisurely, sighed impatiently, and said she was seeing a pattern where none existed. To him, and to the entire system, Melissa was just another adult woman who probably wanted to disappear. An emotional escape, a nervous breakdown, a case of no consequence. Dana tried to argue, showing the images of the white van, the coincidental times, the calls that weren't investigated. But every word she said seemed to bounce off an invisible wall of bureaucracy and indifference. That's when she heard the phrase that made her lose control. "Collins, maybe you're taking this too. Personally, women disappear all the time. You can't save them all." Those words echoed in her head for days. "What do you mean? You can't save them all?" For Dana, each name in a file represented a life cut short, a family shattered, a fear that shouldn't exist. She felt anger. Anger at the apathy, anger at the system, anger at knowing that if no one believed her, perhaps the monster behind those disappearances was still roaming the same streets. Despite being advised to move on, Dana decided to continue the investigation on her own. She began revisiting the scenes of the incidents, always alone without her badge on display. She spent her nights observing the blocks where the van had passed, noting patterns of times, routes, and faces. Some people were suspicious of her presence, others pretended not to see her, but she didn't care. Her instinct told her she was onto something big, and that instinct was rarely wrong. As the weeks passed, the isolation began to take its toll. Her colleagues avoided her in the cafeteria, commenting behind her back that she was obsessed. But what no one understood was that Dana's obsession was actually a form of empathy. She saw something in Melissa she couldn't explain, a kind of reflection of herself. The detective also knew the weight of abandonment. When she was a child, her mother disappeared without a trace, and to this day no one knows what really happened. Perhaps that was why Dana couldn't give up. It wasn't just about solving a case. It was about preventing another woman from being forgotten like her mother had been. One cloudy morning, she returned to the vacant lot. Posing as a property appraiser, she asked to look around. The owner, a calm-looking man with polite manners, called out, "George Heller." He worked as a maintenance technician and said he rented the space to store old tools. Nothing about him seemed out of the ordinary, perhaps too much so. Dana noticed his steady gaze, the control in his words, the restrained smile. There was something in his manner that didn't quite fit the surroundings. Before leaving, she noticed a thick chain locking the container at the back of the lot. George explained matter-of-factly, "Expensive equipment. I can't let anyone touch it." She smiled, thanked him, and left, but his name kept echoing in her head. Back at the department, she tried to access George's record. She discovered that he had worked for a transportation company for years and that, curiously, his name appeared in records near the other disappearances. It wasn't proof, but it was too much of a coincidence to ignore. Dana took the information to the captain again, hopeful. This time, he didn't even look at the report. He just shook his head and said, "There's nothing solid, no evidence, no warrant." It was then that Dana realized she was truly alone, and this loneliness hurt more than any criticism. She felt as if she were fighting a much greater force, not just a criminal, but an entire system, designed to doubt. Still, she didn't give up. If the truth needed to be wrested from her own hands, she would do it. In the following days, he began to act discreetly. He spoke again with the other victims' families, took notes, compared testimonies, and realized that in every case there were reports of a helpful man, offering assistance with minor household repairs. He was always kind, polite, and soft-spoken, and in every case the name George appeared in some way, sometimes as a technician, sometimes as an acquaintance of a neighbor. The problem was that the deeper she dug, the more she realized something strange was happening within the police station itself. Files were disappearing, recordings were being overwritten, and reports she had filed herself were disappearing from the computer system. Someone was covering something up, or trying to silence her. She began to notice different looks from her colleagues, whispers that stopped when she entered the room. All of this only heightened the feeling that she had touched something very dangerous. By then, Dana no longer knew who to trust. The nights grew long, and the fear of being watched became part of her routine. Sometimes, when she glanced in the rear-view mirror, she swore she saw the headlights of a car following her for miles. Other times, she woke in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. But deep down, she knew she couldn't back down. Every ignored signal, every complicit, Silence from the police was a reminder that someone was still missing, and if the system wouldn't do anything, she would. What Dana didn't realize was that by persisting alone, she was beginning to attract exactly the kind of attention she feared most. Because while everyone else doubted her, someone out there knew the detective was getting closer to the truth, and had already begun watching her too. Dana Collins was no longer sleeping well. The clock read 3 a.m., and she was still sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the notes spread out before her, scribbling lines connecting names, places, and times that, together, formed an invisible map no one else could see. Every line, every detail, seemed to whisper the same thing. Melissa didn't run away. She was taken, and the person responsible was still there, walking the same streets, breathing the same air as everyone else. But no one believed her, and that only increased the burden of continuing alone. It was at that point that Dana realized she had two options: give up and accept oblivion, or break the rules and go her own way. She chose the latter. The next morning she left her badge in the drawer. She didn't want orders. She didn't want bureaucracy. She wanted answers. She got in her car and drove straight to Melissa's neighborhood. The street was quiet, with the same rows of houses, the same well-tended gardens, and, in the distance, the same lot where George Heller kept the locked container. Dana parked at a distance, watching for long minutes. There was no movement. A dog barked from time to time, the wind shook the rusty fence. Everything seemed normal, too normal. So she got out of the car and started walking. She carried a clipboard and an old badge to pretend to be an electric company employee. She knocked on doors, chatting with neighbors, asking about power outages. It was a perfect excuse to observe what no one else could see. People greeted her with polite smiles, some briefly commenting on Melissa's disappearance, as if recounting a bad dream they'd rather forget. But one neighbor, an elderly woman with a trembling look in her eyes, paused before answering. She said she sometimes heard metallic noises in the early morning hours, coming from the direction of George's property. Like someone dragging chains, she murmured, almost whispering. Dana felt her body go cold, but she simply waved, thanked them, and kept walking. Back in the car, she took a deep breath. She knew she was getting closer, but she also knew that crossing that line meant losing any chance of turning back. She started the engine, glanced in the mirror, and saw her own reflection. Tired eyes, a hard expression, but a bright spark of determination. She decided it would be tonight. She would return to the field alone and find evidence. She didn't need a warrant. She needed courage. The sun slowly set, and Springfield was swallowed by darkness. Dana pulled on a dark jacket, tied up her hair, and pocketed a flashlight and camera. Everything was silent when she parked again a few blocks away. Her heart was pounding, not from fear, but from that mix of tension and the certainty that she was about to discover something big. She walked to the lot, the sound of her own footsteps muffled by the tall grass. The fence was locked with a simple padlock, which she picked with a quick movement. She entered. The air was heavy. The smell of rust and burnt oil assaulted her nostrils. Ahead, the A container, locked with the same thick chain she had seen days before. For a moment, Dana stood still, staring at the metal object reflecting the dim moonlight. She listened for something. Footsteps, voices, breathing. But everything was silent. The silence was so thick it felt weightless. She approached slowly, touching the cold structure with her fingertips. There were marks there, scratches as if someone had tried to get out. The sound of the wind seemed to whisper through the cracks. The detective felt her stomach churn. She took a few quick shots with her camera, packed everything away, and left without looking back. That night, she could barely breathe properly. Back at the apartment, Dana watched the video over and over. With each pause, a new detail appeared. A shadow on the side of the container, a rusty handprint near the lock, and something that looked like fabric, a piece of clothing stuck to the metal. It was impossible to tell whose it belonged to, but the floral pattern made her heart race. The same pattern that appeared in the photo of the dress Melissa was wearing the day she disappeared. She didn't want to believe it, but deep down, she already knew. The dilemma now was different. Continue alone or try once again to convince someone in the corporation. She thought about everything she had already lost, trying to prove what she saw: credibility, friendships, sleep, peace. But there was a voice inside her, insistent. telling her she couldn't stop. So she printed the photos, wrote down the details and put together a complete dossier. She spent the night writing, cross-referencing data, piecing together what no one else wanted to. When she finished, dawn was already breaking through the window. The plan was simple. Return during the day, pretending to be on a new patrol, and observe George's behavior. He wanted to see how he would react to learning someone had been there. At 8 in the morning, he parked near the garage where he worked. He saw the man from afar walking calmly, wearing the same blue uniform and that neutral smile. He looked ordinary, almost friendly, but there was something icy in his eyes. When Dana approached, he recognized her. "We've met before, haven't we?" he asked in a too calm voice. She smiled and nodded. "Yes, I was checking out the lot. Nice place." He nodded, wiping his hands on a cloth, and replied, "Old, but still useful. I keep a lot of stuff there." The way he said, "a lot," made Dana's blood run cold. It was a brief moment, but the intonation was different, charged with something she couldn't quite define. A sick pleasure, perhaps. When she pulled away, she noticed George watching her from afar, motionless, following her steps to the car. That exchange of glances made it clear they both knew they were playing the same game, one of silence, distrust, and secrets. That night, Dana didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She knew she'd crossed a line. This wasn't just an investigation anymore. It was a personal war. And the worst part was that somewhere in the city, someone was watching her every move, maybe smiling, maybe just waiting for the right moment to act. And when that moment came, well, Dana didn't yet know what the cost would be. From that point on, Dana's life began to spiral into a silent spiral of exhaustion and paranoia. She woke up every day with her eyes burning from reviewing the same notes, the same videos, the same photos. It seemed like everything was repeating itself, like an endless cycle. Each new attempt to follow the leads was met with closed doors, disdainful looks, and a loneliness that began to weigh heavily. No one in the department spoke to her anymore. Her name became a running joke among her colleagues, who called her the ghost detective, but what they called obsession, she called justice. Even so, the isolation slowly wore away at Dana. The once organized apartment was now covered in stacks of papers, photos, and notes pinned to the walls. In the center of the room, Melissa Turner's name was circled in red. Sometimes Dana would wake in the middle of the night thinking she heard Melissa's voice, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, coming from somewhere between reason and delirium. She knew it was exhaustion speaking, but she still left the light on, just to feel less alone. Her body began to take its toll. Dark circles deepened, her stomach rejected food, and her head ached with alarming frequency. Still, she pressed on. She would leave at dawn to survey George's land, sitting in her car for hours, with the headlights off, just watching. Sometimes she would see the man pacing back and forth, fiddling with locks, moving boxes, talking to himself. Other times he would disappear for days and the silence became unbearable. One night, while watching his house, Dana noticed something different. The backyard lights were on, and a muffled sound came from the container. It was like a moan, short, restrained, but enough to make her heart race. Her first reaction was to grab her cell phone and call the police department, but what would she say? That she was spying on a suspect without a warrant in the middle of the night? That she heard a noise and thought it might be a victim? They would laugh at her again. So she hung up the phone and stood there, her hands shaking and her heart beating too fast. In the following days, Dana began to act like a shadow. She avoided interactions, turned off social media, and changed her phone number. She didn't want to be tracked. She began to notice small things out of place. A car parked too long on the corner, a noise in the hallway, an unsigned note left on the door. "You should stop." It was short, direct, cold, and it was enough to make her realize someone knew what she was doing. From that moment on, fear stopped being just a feeling and became a presence. Dana began sleeping with the gun next to her bed, locked all the windows, and spent her nights awake, watching the shadows cast by the streetlights. She felt watched, and deep down she knew she was. George seemed to know her every move. Sometimes, when she saw him from a distance, he would wave slightly, with that same calm smile that kept her alert. It was a silent provocation, as if to say, I know you know, but you can't prove it. One rainy afternoon, as she was leaving the hospital, where she was trying to visit a witness connected to the case, Dana noticed that her windshield wiper was stuck. There was a carefully folded piece of paper there. Opening it, she found a printed photo. It was of her, sitting inside her car, looking out over George's land. The image had been taken from behind, from an angle that could only have been captured by someone very close. On the back, a single sentence was written in short, crooked letters: "You're looking at the wrong place." From that day on, Dana lost all peace. She no longer knew what was real and what was paranoia. Everything seemed distorted. She began to distrust everyone, her colleagues, her neighbors, even her few remaining friends. But one certainty still pulsed within her. Melissa was alive, and this conviction, even without proof, was what kept her going. Yet each step toward the truth seemed to push her deeper into a maze with no exit. Emotional exhaustion left her vulnerable, her mind wavering between lucidity and delirium, and the line between right and wrong began to blur. Even so, she knew she couldn't stop. There was something I hadn't yet seen, a detail hidden amidst all those clues, something right before her eyes that would explain everything. And that night, as she reviewed the container footage for the 100th time, Dana noticed something she'd never noticed before. A reflection, a quick, almost imperceptible movement in the corner of the screen, something that hadn't been there before, a glint of metal, and something moving. Her heart raced, and for the first time in weeks, a glimmer of hope pierced her exhaustion. She paused the video, zoomed in, and there in the darkness was something that would completely change the course of history. George Heller's face was inconspicuous. He was the kind of man who could go unnoticed in any crowd. Medium height, hair just beginning to grey, clothes always too clean, and a calm, almost studious demeanor. He had worked for years as a maintenance technician, the man who fixed what no one else wanted to touch. Neighbors described him as polite, solitary, and helpful. He would always help an elderly woman mow her lawn, change a light bulb here, fix a fence there. He had a discreet smile and a look that, at first glance, exuded confidence. But there was something about him that escaped the ordinary eye. An excessive stillness, an almost artificial control, as if every gesture were rehearsed to hide what really lay beneath. George lived alone in an old house, far enough away to avoid arousing curiosity, but close enough to observe the neighborhood's activity. The yard was surrounded by a rusty fence, the lawn always meticulously mowed, and in the background, the metal container. He told everyone it stored tools and scrap metal, but what no one knew was that the container hid more than just scrap metal. Inside, the air was thick, stifling, and the silence was punctuated only by metallic clangs, the sound of chains lightly clanging against each other, the sound of the pent-up breathing of those who lived inside. Nameless, voiceless, and with no escape. George's past was a collection of barely healed scars. The only child of a war veteran and an overly religious mother, he grew up surrounded by rigidity and silence. His father taught him that weakness was a sin, his mother that suffering was purification. When she died, he was only 16, and he lived alone with his father, a cold man obsessed with discipline and punishment. George grew up learning that control was power, and when his father finally died, he didn't cry. He just kept the key to the basement, where the old man would lock him for hours and never spoke of it again. He worked in different places throughout his life, moving from town to town whenever something went wrong. In Springfield, he seemed to have found the perfect balance. A small town without prying eyes, without many secrets. There he could be what he always was, the invisible man. But behind the peaceful routine, he hid an old desire, an impulse he tried to keep, under control, but which grew stronger and stronger. It wasn't a sexual desire, nor simply violent, it was something deeper. George relished the power to make someone disappear, to erase a life without a trace, to know that every day, while the town went on as usual, someone was under his control, completely dependent on his will. The container appeared almost by chance. At first it was just a storage room. Then it became a refuge, a space where no one entered, where he could be his true self. And when Melissa crossed his path, something inside George awakened. He'd observed her for weeks before her disappearance, at the grocery store, on her way to work, in front of her house. He liked how she always seemed hurried, distracted, vulnerable. He studied her routine with the same patience as someone dismantling a watch. He knew her schedules, her routes, even the moments when she felt most alone. And when he decided to act, he was swift, precise, almost surgical. That afternoon of August 14th, as Melissa was loading her groceries into the car, he approached smiling, pretending to be a city worker checking for leaks in the street. It was enough to distract her for a few seconds, long enough for the anesthetic cloth to cover her face. The rest was silence. George worked quickly, driven by a frightening coolness. He got her to the lot in less than 10 minutes, and when the sound of the lock echoed for the first time inside the container, a kind of peace washed over him. Peace, for George has always meant absolute control. As the days passed, he turned his captivity into a ritual. He visited the container at different times, never saying much, just observing. Sometimes he brought food, other times he just stood there, staring at Melissa, as if studying her every reaction. She, weak and disoriented, could barely maintain eye contact, and that satisfied him. He enjoyed the fear, not the scream, but the submissive look, the held breath. That was where he felt powerful. But George was also clever. He knew how to disguise every trace of suspicious behavior. When the police began investigating the disappearance, he was one of the first to volunteer to help with the search. He even offered his backyard for inspection, and when officers looked, they saw only the padlocked container. Nothing seemed out of place. He smiled, offered coffee, and even wished them good luck with the investigation. The disguise was perfect. What no one realized was that behind that controlled facade, George was also beginning to lose control. His visits to the container became longer, the intervals shorter. He began to hear voices inside his head, echoes of the past mixed with the muffled sounds from within the metal. Sometimes he talked to himself, berating himself aloud, as if his father were still there, demanding discipline. Other times, he simply stared at the container for minutes at a time, breathing deeply, trying to contain something that even he couldn't quite understand. And it was during one of those nights, while observing the container, that he noticed something different. The lock was slightly off, and one of the chains appeared to have been tampered with. Melissa had tried to escape. His blood boiled. He stormed in, screaming, the clang echoing throughout the yard. But when he looked at her, instead of fear, he saw resistance. For the first time, Melissa was staring at him with hatred. It disconcerted him. For a second, the cold mask of control shattered, and the monster that had always lived inside him emerged. From that day on, George became more violent, more unpredictable, and at the same time, more paranoid. He began to feel like someone was watching him. He became suspicious of everything. The neighbors, the noises, even the sound of his own footsteps. Sometimes he would wake at night feeling like someone was watching through the cracks in the window. He didn't know it, but Dana was indeed nearby. She was watching him. And perhaps the scariest thing was that George seemed to enjoy it. He relished the idea of someone trying to get to him, of playing with the truth, of feeling one step ahead. The game excited him, fed his sick ego. But he didn't know that this time the tables were about to turn, and that the power he believed he had over everything and everyone was about to crumble in the face of a discovery he could never control. It was on a cold January afternoon that history took its cruelest turn. 3 months after Melissa's disappearance, Springfield was once again gripped by panic. Another woman, Clara Jensen, disappeared under almost identical circumstances. She was 32 years old, a teacher, and lived just 6 blocks from Melissa's house. She left work saying she was going to the grocery store before heading home and disappeared. The car was found in the same situation, perfectly parked with no sign of a break-in, the keys in the ignition, her purse intact. When the news reached Dana, she froze. The pattern was repeating itself. The same lightning strike, the same modus operandi, the same silence from the police. Only this time, she wouldn't wait for the system to act. That night, Dana pasted Clara's name on the map, connecting the lines with Melissa's. Their routes intersected on a narrow, seldom-traveled street, surrounded by old houses and a vacant lot. The same lot she'd visited before, the same one where George kept the container. Her heart raced. The pieces were starting to fit together, and the feeling of being alone no longer mattered. All that remained was to act. She spent the next 2 days gathering everything she had, Photos, audio, notes, ignored reports, even small details jotted down on napkins. On each piece of paper was a fragment of the truth no one wanted to see. When she finished, she realized the only way to prove her case was with something that spoke for itself. Living proof, something no one could deny. And for that, she would need to go back there. The dawn of the day, February 9th, 2017, was born frozen. Springfield was asleep, and Dana, for the first time in weeks, felt her entire body vibrating with nervousness and purpose. She knew she couldn't go alone, so she looked for someone she still trusted. Rick Dalton, a retired firefighter, who had previously worked in rescue operations and owed the detective an old favor. When Dana called, he didn't ask many questions. He just listened to the tone of her voice and replied, "Tell me where and when." They met around 2 in the morning, a few blocks from the lot. The sky was overcast, the wind biting. Dana explained everything in a low voice, while Rick observed the area through binoculars. There was no light coming from George's house, only the imposing shadow of the container in the pale glow of the moon. It was like a sleeping monster. "Are you sure about this, Collins?" he asked. She responded with just a look, the kind of look that leaves no room for doubt. They climbed the fence and walked slowly across the lot, their flashlights off, their footsteps sinking into the damp earth. The air was heavy, the silence almost suffocating. As they approached the container, Dana noticed the padlock was different. It wasn't the same as before. It had been replaced, and around the chain was a kind of reinforced wire. Rick pulled a small pair of pliers from his pocket and began cutting the wire. Each snap echoed too loudly. Dana's heart was pounding so hard she thought the sound might give them away. When the last piece fell, she took a deep breath and with a quick movement pulled the lock. The metallic clang that followed felt like the end of a wait that had already lasted too long. The door creaked open, and the smell that escaped made Rick take a step back. It was a metallic odor, mixed with rust, mildew, and something deeper. The smell of living people who hadn't seen light in a long time. Dana shone her flashlight inside, and the beam cut through the darkness like a blade. For a second, her brain refused to comprehend what her eyes saw. In the corner, among dirty blankets and rusty chains, stood a woman. Her skin was pale, her gaze was lost, her body too weak to react. It took Dana a few seconds to process before letting out a muffled cry. "Oh my God, it's her! Melissa Turner, Viva." Rick rushed to help her while Dana tried to control her trembling hands. Melissa blinked slowly, as if she couldn't believe she was seeing real people. When the flashlight touched her face, she looked away, her entire body trembling. The chains were still attached to her ankles and wrists, and the marks on her body showed that this hell had been going on for months. Rick carefully cut the chains. Melissa was crying soundlessly, only tears streaming down her thin, almost transparent face. Dana knelt beside her, and for a moment all the voices, fears, and suspicions disappeared. It was as if time had stopped there, inside that metal cube that hid the truth of an entire city. Outside, a distant sound shattered the silence, the creak of a door opening, heavy footsteps on the grass. Dana turned off the flashlight, signaled Rick, and dragged Melissa behind a stack of boxes. The sound of footsteps was getting closer. George was there. Dana's heart felt like it was about to explode. George walked slowly, the sound of his boots against metal echoing throughout the space. He stopped in front of the container, and for a second, Dana was sure he knew. The man stood still, watching, the sound of the key ring jingling, the click of the padlock being tested. After a few seconds, the longest of Dana's life, he sighed and walked away. The house door closed again, and silence returned. Dana took a deep breath, still shaking. Rick looked at her and whispered, "We have to get her out of here now." They carried Melissa in their arms, crossing the lot in complete silence. When they reached the car, Dana started the engine without turning on the headlights and sped down the dark street, her heart pounding and the sound of tires slicing the asphalt. Melissa, still conscious, held the detective's arm tightly, as if afraid it was all just a dream. Dana glanced in the rearview mirror and saw in the distance George's figure standing in the middle of the street, motionless, just watching the car drive away. He didn't run, didn't scream. He just stood there, watching, with that same calm smile that now seemed more sinister than ever. That early morning, as the car disappeared into the empty streets, Dana knew the game had changed. She had achieved what no one believed possible, finding Melissa alive. But deep down, between relief and fear, a doubt began to grow. What else was George hiding inside that lot? And for how long had he been doing this without anyone noticing? The dawn of that day seemed to bring relief, but Dana's hell was only beginning. After Melissa's rescue, what she expected to be a moment of redemption turned, within hours, into a bureaucratic nightmare. When she finally took Melissa to the hospital, the first police teams arrived, alerted by an anonymous call. Someone had reported a trespassing on private property. Dana tried to explain, still breathless, what she had found. She spoke quickly, her hands shaking, repeating the same thing. She was there. She was alive. But the looks around her showed no understanding. They showed distrust. The captain, the same one who had ordered her to drop the case, arrived minutes later. His tone was completely cold. "You trespassed without a warrant, Collins. What kind of evidence do you expect to present now?" The sentence hit her like a blow. It didn't matter that Melissa was alive, that there were chains and injuries. None of that seemed relevant given this breach of protocol. As she tried to contain her anger, she saw Melissa's face lying on the gurney, covered by a grey blanket, surrounded by nurses. She was still breathing heavily, barely able to speak. Dana tried to approach, but was pulled away by another officer. "You're not authorized to be here," they said. Hours later, at the barracks, the interrogation began. They wanted to know why she was there, why she had taken a civilian, Rick, on an unauthorized operation, why she had forged evidence without supervision. Each question was a knife slowly turning inside her. She tried to explain, showing the photos, the videos, the full report, but the skeptical gaze of her superiors said it all. None of her words seemed to have any value. For them, what mattered now was the institutional damage, a detective acting on her own, an illegal rescue, and an investigation that exposed the corporation's incompetence. Meanwhile, George Heller was being held temporarily for fact-checking. Police officers who searched his home found everything in order: tools, boxes, work documents. When the container was finally officially opened, it was empty. No chains, no traces of blood, nothing. The floor had been cleaned with something strong, almost corrosive. The place looked new. No physical evidence that anyone had been there. The official report was blunt. No concrete evidence of foul play. George was released the same day. When Dana found out, she stood still for long minutes. Her throat tightened. Her breath seemed to disappear. How could this be? How could someone clean up so quickly? Then came the question that haunted her like an echo. Who had made the anonymous call to report the break-in? It was almost obvious. George had known everything. He had anticipated her actions. In the following days, frustration gave way to anger. Dana tried again to visit Melissa in the hospital, but was denied access. Everything was now under federal investigation. Melissa had been transferred to a secure facility, and doctors said she was too traumatized to speak. The few words she managed to utter were jumbled and fragmented. She repeated the name George between sobs, but her testimony was not considered coherent. The truth was being swallowed, manipulated, erased before the eyes of those who fought to expose it. Dana was temporarily removed from the force. The official justification: violation of conduct protocols and psychological impairment. Bitter irony. The woman who had achieved the impossible was now treated as a threat. Colleagues avoided contact, and local headlines began to doubt her version of events. "Detective acts on his own, creating confusion in cold case," read one newspaper. It was as if the entire city was being anesthetized by a convenient version of the story, one in which George was just an innocent man and she was an unstable cop with a persecution complex. The nights were silent again, but not as before. Now the silence was fraught with impotence. Dana spent hours staring at the empty wall, remembering Melissa's eyes at the moment of her rescue, that look of someone who had seen hell and survived. No cleaning, no report, no lie could erase what she saw inside that container. But there was something Dana didn't know. While she was being pushed aside, George returned to his usual calm, and the town, once again, chose to look the other way. Until a new disappearance, weeks later, would turn everything upside down and prove once and for all that the real mistake wasn't hers. It was the doubters. The following days were a mixture of silence and anger. Dana, now removed, felt time passing like a punishment. She spent her mornings at home, surrounded by newspaper clippings, trying to understand where she had gone wrong, and her nights staring out the window with the constant feeling of being watched. She no longer had access to anything. Not the files, not the cameras, not the people. It was as if her existence had been erased from the force itself. All she was left with was anger and the conviction that George was still at large, and worse, laughing at her. Then, on a rainy March afternoon, an unfamiliar number appeared on the phone. The voice on the other end was firm, professional, but carried something different. "Detective Collins, this is Agent Robert Lane from the FBI. The Turner case has fallen into our hands and we'd like to talk." Dana took a few seconds to respond. Finally, someone was listening. The meeting took place in a discreet room in a federal building a few miles from Springfield. Robert was an experienced man, with a watchful eye and the patience of someone who knows that the best information comes when the other person feels safe. He listened to Dana speak for almost an hour without interrupting. She told him everything, from the first disappearance to the night of the rescue, every detail, every smell, every look. She showed him the videos, the photos, the records she had saved in personal copies. When she finished, he expected the same look of disbelief he was already familiar with, but it didn't come. Robert remained silent, leafing through the evidence carefully. "You're not wrong. Collins, we're tracking this man too. He may be involved in other cases across the state." Those words rang like oxygen. After months of doubt, someone finally believed her. Robert explained that the FBI had already been tracking similar disappearances in other nearby cities, all with the same pattern, the same time span, the same victim profile. Melissa wasn't the first. And what made it all even more disturbing was that, in some old reports, George Heller's name already appeared, always in the background, always unnoticed. "He's methodical, intelligent, and far more dangerous than he seems," the agent said, folding his hands on the table. "And from what you've described, he's getting careless. This is the perfect time to catch him." Dana felt her heart race. The flame that had almost died out reignited. Finally, she would have help. In the days that followed, she and the FBI began to mount a silent operation. No fanfare, no uniforms. The plan was to observe George closely, map his steps, monitor his routes, and wait for the right moment to act. They installed discreet cameras on poles near the property and tracked calls made from local payphones. His every move was recorded, analyzed, dissected. He seemed to live the same routine as always. Work, home, quick trips to the grocery store, but there was a calmness that felt rehearsed, almost theatrical. Dana began collaborating in an officially unacknowledged manner. The FBI team knew she possessed the instinct, the technical. Reports lacked. She knew the criminal's gaze, his silences, the way he disguised nervousness by feigning kindness. In one of the recordings made outside the compound, they noticed a behavior that caught their attention. George would leave early in the morning and drive to a dirt road on the edge of town, where he would stop for long minutes, headlights off. When he returned, he would bring boxes covered with tarps and store them inside the garage. No one knew what was inside, but the pattern repeated itself every Thursday. With each new clue, the tension mounted. Dana wanted to act quickly, but Robert insisted on waiting for the right moment. "He has a pattern, and every pattern has a flaw," he said. "We need him to show his." She understood, but patience was beginning to cost her. The town remained fearful, and George's name still wasn't making any headlines. Until one night, the FBI team's radio crackled with urgent information. A young woman named Laura Peters, 27, had disappeared after leaving a supermarket. The car once again had been found intact. Dana felt a shiver run through her entire body. The pattern was repeating itself, and deep down, she knew George was playing them. The operation was launched immediately. Discreet cars surrounded the area without sirens, and Dana, even though officially removed, insisted on participating. Robert hesitated, but then allowed it. "You know him better than any of us," he said, "but keep your cool." As the agents set up a siege around the area, Dana watched George's property through binoculars. The lights were off, the gate locked, and the silence was the same deafening silence as ever. The clock read 2:47 a.m. when she saw a figure crossing the yard. Tall, thin, with deliberate movements. It was him. George emerged carrying something in his hands, a box covered in a dark tarp, and walked toward the container. Dana looked at Robert and whispered, "This is it." The agents prepared, taking silent positions. Around the house, the wind picked up, swaying the trees, the sound of metal scraping the ground. George opened the container and stood there, motionless, for several long seconds, as if listening for something. Then, a faint, almost imperceptible voice came from inside, a female voice. Dana felt her body freeze. It wasn't an echo, it wasn't a noise, it was a cry for help. She looked at Robert, and he just nodded. The order was given in a low voice. Now. And when the agents began to move in, what happened next would be forever etched in Dana's memory, because what they found inside would not only confirm what she had been saying for months, but would reveal a horror even greater than she ever imagined. The moment of their advance was almost silent, but the air seemed to vibrate. The agent's boots stomped firmly on the damp ground, and Dana walked right behind Robert, her gun drawn, her heart pounding. The ground was shrouded in thick darkness, the kind of silence that precedes something inevitable. The container loomed before them like a solid shadow, an almost living presence. George Heller was still there, his back to them, standing before the metal door, motionless, as if waiting. When he caught the reflection of the flashlights, he turned slowly, and his once calm face now displayed a cold, disturbing half-smile. "FBI, drop everything and step back," Robert shouted, his firm voice cutting through the wind. George didn't move. He just looked around, measuring each step, and gave a soft, muffled laugh. "You don't understand," he murmured. "They're not victims. They're chosen." The sentence made Dana's stomach churn. She took a step forward, her finger firmly on the trigger, but his gaze remained blank, calm, as if this were all part of a plan. Two agents grabbed him before he could escape. As they handcuffed him, George continued to speak, almost calmly. "You're late. You've always been late." Dana walked past him without responding, the metallic smell of the container already piercing the air. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the padlock. Robert signaled for it to be broken, and one of the agents used the bolt cutters to cut the metal. The snap of the chain echoed like thunder. When the door opened, the world seemed to stop. The heavy stench escaped first, a mixture of mildew, rust, and something much deeper, something human. Dana raised the flashlight, and the beam revealed the impossible. In the corner, chained to a rusty pipe, was Laura Peters, alive but in critical condition, covered in marks and dirt, her eyes wide with fear. Around her were 3 old mattresses and the remains of torn women's clothing. On one of the walls, names were scratched with something sharp. They were dates, and beneath each date a different name. Melissa, Clara, other women. Dana felt her entire body shiver. Time seemed to dissolve as she walked through the narrow space, the sound of metal creaking underfoot. Every object there told a story no one wanted to. Here, ancient chains, tools, medicine bottles, scraps of fabric, all meticulously stored. George wasn't an impulsive man. He was methodical, calculating, the kind of predator who turns horror into routine. Laura tried to speak, but her voice came out like a whisper. He said he'd come back." Dana knelt and took her hand. "You're safe now, Laura. It's over." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't over. This was just the surface. Outside, the agents searched the house. In a locked room, they found boxes containing old tapes, detailed records, and personal belongings belonging to the victims, including a wedding ring bearing the initials MT. Each discovery was a stab in Dana's conscience. Each piece of evidence confirmed what she'd been screaming for months, while the world doubted it. The monster had always been there, 2 streets away from where everyone was looking. George, handcuffed and sitting on the floor, watched everything with a blank, almost satisfied look. "You think it's over," he murmured. "This is just a fragment. I didn't do it all alone." Robert leaned closer, pressing. "Who else is involved?" But George just smiled, a smile that sent chills down everyone's spine. Some truths can't stand the light. Dana stared at him, trying to decipher the meaning behind his words. I knew it might be a bluff, but something in his tone rang true. For a moment, fear mingled with victory. Melissa was alive, Laura too. But what about the others? How many more had disappeared before George's name crossed the police radar? As the container was sealed off and the experts began their work, Dana stepped back a few feet and stood in the light rain that was beginning to fall. She looked up at the sky and took a deep breath. Everything she'd imagined, every doubt, every insomnia, every accusation, was there before her, proven. But the feeling wasn't of relief. It was of emptiness, because deep down, she knew there was something that still didn't make sense. George spoke as if he were part of something bigger, something that went beyond Springfield, beyond this land, beyond her. And as the forensic vehicles lit up the night, Dana had the nagging feeling that the story wasn't over yet. Because inside the container, among the collected objects, there was a smaller box forgotten in a corner, with a single handwritten label, No 7, waiting. And next to it, a new chain, still clean, as if ready to be used. The sun hadn't even risen when Dana left the lot. The light early morning rain now mingled with distant sirens and the flashes of cameras beginning to flood the area. The case had exploded in just a few hours. Headlines plastered George Heller as the dumpster monster, and his serene, expressionless face dominated the news. But for Dana there was no sense of victory. What she felt was a weariness that came from within, a weight that no prison could lift. At the hospital, Melissa and Laura lay side by side, both in critical condition, but alive. Dana spent the day between depositions and interrogation rooms, surrounded by agents and reporters who now wanted to hear from the heroine who defied the system. Cruel irony. Months earlier, the same people who had called her obsessed were now celebrating her. But she couldn't feel part of any of it. The image that kept coming back to her was Melissa, sitting on the bed, her eyes lost, her hands waving nervously, as if trying to remember where it all began. Dana approached, and the woman recognized her. He tried to smile, but his face contorted with pain. "I heard you," Melissa whispered weakly. "That night, you called my name." Dana held her hand tightly. "And I heard yours," she replied, unable to hold back her tears. For a moment, they were both silent, connected by something no words could describe. Two survivors, each in their own way. Outside, the press was turning everything into a spectacle. There were journalists at the hospital gates, reporters outside George's house, TV shows showing old photos of the victims. The entire country seemed to want to consume the horror in real time, while Dana, for the first time, just wanted to disappear. She requested temporary leave, turned in her badge, and began avoiding calls and interviews. The victory tasted bitter. She knew George wasn't just an isolated maniac. The evidence, the names, the tapes, everything indicated he was part of something bigger. And the most disturbing thing was that George himself seemed to know it. During the interrogation, he maintained his same calm, almost polite demeanor. He answered what was necessary, sometimes smiling, and whenever pressed, he would say the same thing. "You'll come back to me." No one understood what he meant, but Dana did. She knew him. She knew that kind of man never just talks. He wanted to sow doubt, and he succeeded. In the weeks that followed, the city of Springfield attempted to return to normal, but fear took root. George's lot was fenced off, the container removed, but no one looked at that block the same way again. The silence of the street, once peaceful, was now synonymous with memory. Mothers began picking up their children from school early. Women avoided going out alone at night, and every metallic clang seemed to carry the echo of the horror that had been hidden there for so long. Dana, for her part, withdrew completely. She sold her apartment and moved into a small house near the lake, trying to reconnect with something that still made sense. She spent her mornings in silence, watching the reflection in the water, and her nights mentally reviewing each step of the case. Sometimes she dreamed of the container, the sound of the lock, the smell of iron, her breath held in the darkness. She woke in a cold sweat with the feeling that someone was still inside, waiting. One night when she arrived home, she found an envelope left under her door. Inside was just one photo, a grainy image taken from a distance. It was of her, walking near the lake, head down, unaware she was being watched. On the back, a sentence written in small letters, "Some chains never break." Dana stood still, staring at the paper with trembling hands. The wind outside blew against the windows, and a shiver ran down her spine. It could have been a provocation, it could have been a coincidence, but deep down, she knew. George Heller's shadow hadn't been completely erased, and even trapped, the monster still found a way to breathe. The next day, she returned to the hospital to see Melissa one last time. He found her sitting, staring out the window, stronger, but with the same distant look. "Are you leaving town?" Melissa asked, her gaze never leaving the horizon. Dana nodded. "But I won't stop looking back." They both fell silent, and the sun streamed through the window, illuminating the white room. For the first time there were no words, only the weight of what they had experienced, and the knowledge that some stories never truly end. On her way out, Dana crossed the hallway and passed a television tuned to the news. A new headline flashed in red letters. "Woman disappears in neighboring town. Case resembles pattern of Springfield crimes." She stopped, staring at the screen, her heart racing again. The reporter was saying the victim's name. Young, living alone, disappeared after leaving work. Everything was the same, everything starting over, and in that moment, Dana understood that the cycle hadn't been broken, just paused. The true horror wasn't in the chains, nor the container, nor George Heller. The horror lay in the certainty that, while the world tries to forget, evil only changes address and waits for the next name to begin again. Months had passed since the case that changed the city and destroyed everything Dana believed about justice, but the scar of that winter never completely healed. George Heller's trial took place under heavy media surveillance, with cameras at the courthouse doors and an audience of onlookers who seemed to be watching a spectacle. He arrived handcuffed, with the same calm expression and blank stare, as if nothing had affected him. He sat before the jury and for hours listened to the prosecutors describe every detail of his crimes, the torture, the captivity, the recorded voices, the chains. He never showed any remorse. He just smiled. That same smile Dana knew well, a smile that seemed to hold a truth he would never say aloud. When the verdict was read, the room fell into absolute silence. Life imprisonment without parole. Melissa, sitting in the front row, wept softly. Laura, beside her, kept her eyes fixed on the floor. Dana, standing in the back, felt no relief, only a strange kind of bitter peace. It was the end of a struggle, but not the end of the story. George turned his head toward her before being led away by the guards, and without saying a word winked. A brief gesture, but enough to chill her blood once more. After the sentencing, Springfield tried to erase the traces of the horror. The land was demolished, the container destroyed, and people returned to walking the streets, as if it had all been a distant nightmare. But those who lived through it knew that it was unforgettable. Melissa Turner's name became a symbol of survival, and Dana's face graced news reports about courage and determination. But deep down, she knew nothing was that simple. She carried the trauma like a shadow that wouldn't be erased. She had nightmares about the clanging of chains, the echo of the container being opened, George's face watching silently. Melissa, meanwhile, moved to another state with her son and mother. She was trying to rebuild her life, but freedom had a different weight now. She slept with the lights on, avoided closed spaces, and every unexpected noise made her heart race. Even so, she was breathing, and that in itself was a victory. Dana, retired and living alone near the lake, spent her days writing reports no one asked for, trying to understand the gaps in the investigation. She read and reread the case files, searching for something she might have missed, some clue that would explain how George knew so much, how he always seemed one step ahead. It was as if, even behind bars, he was still dictating the pace of the story. Sometimes, in the quiet early mornings, the phone would ring once and then stop. There was never anyone on the other end. She learned not to answer, but the sound of it making her heart race all the same. One day, while reviewing old documents, he found a yellowed sheet of typewritten paper mistakenly attached to the case file. In the top corner was a federal seal and a short sentence, Operation Delta, 1989, Area 5. Among the names listed, one caught his attention, Heller G., the same name, the same surname decades earlier, and below the words, behavioral testing discontinued for ethical reasons. Dana froze. It couldn't be a coincidence. She carefully put the paper away, feeling the weight of the discovery. Maybe George hadn't been lying when he said he wasn't alone. Maybe somehow someone had helped him. That night, the lake was shrouded in thick fog. Dana stepped out for air and stared at the moon's reflection trembling on the water. The city was asleep, but she couldn't turn it off. It was as if there was something more, a final piece, a truth still hidden. She heard a faint noise behind her, a twig snapping, slow footsteps on the wooden deck. She turned quickly, but there was no one there. Only the distant sound of a phone ringing inside the house. She hurried in, her heart racing, and answered on the third ring. No voice, just slow, deep breathing on the other end. For a moment, she thought it was her imagination playing tricks, but then the voice came, low, hoarse, scratching the silence. "Hey, detective, do you miss the chains?" The click of the disconnect echoed throughout the house. Dana stood still, the phone still in her hand, her gaze fixed on nothing. Outside, the wind blew against the windows and the lake reflected a faint, almost ghostly light. The case everyone thought was over had just begun again, and for the first time, Dana understood that some stories never end. They just change shape, waiting for the right moment to resurface. This video took you to the edge between fear and relief, and somehow made you see how much the truth can be hidden in the shadows for years. Every minute of this story was designed to draw you in, to make you feel the weight of silence, the chill of mystery, and in the end the warmth of justice finally arrived. And if this narrative captivated you, gave you chills, or made you reflect, then it has already served its purpose, to remind you that stories like these need to be told. Now you can be a part of it. When the video gets your like and subscription, it reaches more people who are also interested in these real, intense stories, full of courage and revelations. It's your touch that makes the next video happen. And to show that you have come this far and are part of this community that live the suspense and thrill with every twist and turn, write the word in the comments "true," because that's what drives everything, the search for truth, no matter how dark it seems. And speaking of truth, the next case that appears on the screen will prove to you that some disappearances were never what they seemed. What comes next is even more surprising, and you'll want to be there to find out.